Introduction: the clock failure, the hook. Gaseous humanity has been trained from the cradle to find solace in cheap superstition. When the ordinary biomass looks at its mobile phone screen or its car's digital dashboard and the quartz crystals mark exactly 11:11, its reptilian brain, desperate to escape the crushing mediocrity of daily life, invents a fairy tale. It has been taught to close its eyes, make a wish to the void, and pathetically believe that a legion of angels, spiritual guides, or a benevolent universe is sending it a cosmic hug. This romantic, sugar-coated and harmless vision is the perfect sedative. It is the anesthesia designed by the three-dimensional system. It prevents the slave from understanding the terrifying and majestic mathematical reality of what they have just witnessed. The physics of power, the unbribable science of conscious matter, repudiates this mystical interpretation with undeniable biological disgust. The material universe is not a loving mother sending signals of affection. It is a cold thermodynamic construct, a geometric simulation governed by relentless laws of entropy, gravity, and friction. Within this immense and dark architecture of predictable chaos, 11:11 is not a romantic coincidence, nor a whimsical wink from destiny. It is a structural anomaly. It is a failure in the master clock of the matrix. It is the quantum millisecond in which the source code of the three-dimensional hologram collapses before your retinas, exposing the naked gears of material reality. Why you? Why does your gaze pull away from the hysterical noise of the environment, interrupt the constant flow of your anxiety, and lock onto the liquid crystal screen? Not a millisecond before, not a millisecond after. Mediocre statisticians will tell you it is simple confirmation bias. The physics of power tells you it is pure telemetry. Your consciousness, sickened by the high, volatile, and scattered frequency of the diseased society around you, has begun to densify. As you increase your critical mass, your inner gravity begins to bend your perception of linear time. Time ceases to be a river dragging you along and becomes a solid block. When you see the four perfect, identical, and symmetrical pillars, 11:11, what you experience is an absolute biomechanical synchronization. It is a connection between your nervous system and the underlying architecture of the cosmos. It is a frontal alignment axis. In that instant, entropy freezes. The clock does not advance, the simulation stops, waiting for an execution command. And it is here where the biomass fails, wasting the millisecond on useless wishes. Meanwhile, the quantum monarch recognizes the breach to inject their unalterable will like a lethal virus into the system. This book is not a manual of complacent spirituality for broken souls begging for validation. It is a treatise on existential ballistics. It is the frozen steel of a scalpel designed to amputate your delusions. It is designed to teach you to read the code of the matrix with the coldness of a sovereign architect. If you are prepared to endure the barometric pressure of knowing that reality is a program you can hack, bend, and rewrite with the absolute weight of your charged immobility, then move forward. The master clock has failed. The code has recognized you. Welcome to the non-negotiable machinery of the invisible. Chapter 1: The Broken Symmetry. The human brain is, in its thermodynamic and biological design, a prodigious yet pathetically predictable machine in its survival instinct. When faced with an anomaly that threatens to disintegrate the fundamental laws of reality, the first line of defense is not empirical research but absolute denial. The intellect builds barricades of cheap logic to block the passage of quantum terror. It closes the floodgates, isolates the traumatic event, and injects it with a lethal dose of rationalization to continue operating without collapsing. That Tuesday morning, after slowly backing away from the sink, my mind began that protocol. I moved away from the bathroom doorframe without taking my eyes off the dark hallway, instinctively expecting something, a physical and hostile mass, to emerge from the tiles and chase me. But nothing crossed the threshold. The silence in the apartment was so thick that I could hear the erratic pumping of blood hitting my eardrums. The friction of terror had raised my body temperature. Cold sweat, a thermodynamic paradox of acute anxiety, began to crystallize on my forehead. Retinal fatigue, I pronounced aloud. The vibration of my own vocal cords in the empty air of the hallway provided a microscopic relief. I needed to anchor the event to classical physics. It was, I told myself, a simple and vulgar processing error in the visual cortex. I had spent too many hours in front of screens, straining my eyes in the gloom. A desynchronization between the optic nerve and conscious perception. A neuronal latency. The exhausted brain had taken a millisecond too long to process the image. It created the illusion that the reflection moved with its own will. It was a mathematical, biological, acceptable explanation. I forced myself to breathe deeply, using my diaphragm to force the parasympathetic nervous system to reduce the hysteria of my heartbeat. I walked with stiff steps toward the refuge of my studio. I was desperately seeking the immutability of my controlled environment. The architecture of the place was my sanctuary. My workspace was set up in an L-shaped room, a geometric design I had domesticated myself. Upon crossing the door, the atmospheric pressure of the sound changed drastically. The walls were strategically covered with thick acoustic panels of high-density foam, bass traps in the corners, and geometric wooden diffusers. This structure devoured high and medium frequencies, eliminating any parasitic reverberation and creating an almost anechoic acoustic. In this room, sound did not bounce. It was born, fulfilled its physical function, and died instantly, absorbed by the porous material. It was an environment where the static of the outside world was annihilated, leaving me alone with the massive weight of low frequency. I dropped into the heavy ergonomic chair in front of the desk. The residual heat from the computer equipment caressed my legs. Under the table, the computer tower emitted a constant, deep hum. 32 gigabytes of memory, and an 8-core processor beating in the dark, cooled by the hypnotic spin of fans extracting heat. It was a powerful machine, assembled piece by piece with cold logic. I moved the mouse. The twin monitors emerged from sleep mode, flooding the room with a cold glow. On the main screen, the desktop background was not a static image, but a high-resolution animated loop, a complex fractal geometry turning on itself in an infinite and perfect loop. I stared at it for several minutes. I needed that mathematical perfection. The video loop was predictable. There was no latency, no hidden intentions, just pixels obeying an irrefutable binary code. If quantum physics dictated that the observer alters reality, that wallpaper was proof that, at least within the silicon circuits, order remained unbreakable. I opened the music production software. The dark and aseptic interface of the sequencer filled the screen, showing blocks of audio millimetrically aligned on a temporal grid. I was working on the sound design of a dense project. I loaded a virtual synthesizer and pressed a key on the MIDI controller. A massive, pure and guttural sub-bass sound flooded the room, vibrating the wood of the desk and the floor beneath my feet. I manipulated the oscillators, sculpting the sound wave, trying to let that mechanical and technical activity absorb the excess nervous energy that threatened to paralyze me. I wanted to submerge myself in sound, in the manipulation of frequencies where I was the only architect. However, despite the volume, despite the acoustic pressure filling the L-shaped room, the event at the sink refused to be assimilated. The human mind does not tolerate an information vacuum. When classical logic fails, it seeks refuge in the abysses of metaphysics. While the sub-bass buzzed in the studio, my thoughts began to drift toward dangerous concepts. I thought of quantum superposition. I thought of the erratic behavior of photons when they pass through a double slit and realize they are being observed. If at a subatomic level matter is aware of the gaze and alters its behavior, what prevented that same aberration from occurring at a macroscopic level? A mirror is nothing more than a layer of polished silver trapped behind glass. It reflects light. But light is information. What if the mirror is not a passive surface? What if it is a membrane, an extremely thin event horizon that separates our three-dimensional ecosystem from a thermodynamic reverse? I stopped the audio playback suddenly. Silence fell over the studio like a guillotine, immediately suffocated by the acoustic panels. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the dryness in my corneas. The initial denial began to crack. The theory of visual fatigue was no longer enough to sustain the structure of my sanity because the terror did not reside in the millisecond delay of the blink. The terror resided in the intention. The gaze that being in the glass had returned to me was not the empty gaze of an optical reflection. There was weight in those eyes, there was calculation, evaluation, and a frigid, inhuman patience. I looked to my right. The secondary monitor was off. The liquid crystal display, black and polished, returned a dark and diffuse reflection of the room. I felt a leaden knot in my stomach. A sudden electrical discharge of adrenaline ran through my peripheral nervous system. Suddenly, the off-screen was no longer a computer peripheral. It was a potential abyss. It was an unguarded breach in the security of my fortress. I forced my neck to turn. I fixed my gaze on the dark reflection of my own silhouette. I looked at my outline cut into the black plastic of the monitor. I was still. The dark reflection was still. Slowly, with ridiculous caution, I raised my right hand. The shadow on the off-screen imitated the movement. Physics seemed intact. The optical symmetry was maintained in perfect temporal balance. I exhaled the air I didn't know I was holding. It was just paranoia. Isolation and fatigue were playing with me. But as I lowered my hand, the perturbation manifested again. It was not a temporal delay this time. It was something infinitely more subtle and destructive. The shadow on the off monitor lowered its hand with me. The metric synchronization was impeccable. However, the angle of the shoulders in the reflection, the millimetric tilt of the head, they did not match the tension of my own musculature. It was as if a prodigiously talented actor were imitating my movements in real time from the other side of the screen. He was unable to completely hide his own cadence, his own center of gravity. I turned my head violently, looking away from the monitor. My breathing became agitated, losing its sub-bass depth and becoming shallow and arrhythmic. The symmetry had broken. The anomaly was not an isolated event confined to the bathroom. It had invaded the perimeter. I stood up from the chair, pushing it back with unnecessary force. The L-shaped room, with its absorbent panels, suddenly felt oppressive, like a compression chamber crushing me slowly. I began to walk through the apartment, turning on all the lights in a primitive and useless attempt. I wanted to annihilate the shadows, and that was when the true psychological quarantine began. The silent siege. The apartment, a space I knew to the millimeter, transformed from one moment to the next into a minefield of hostile surfaces. My brain, now operating under a destructive hypervigilance, scanned the environment. It identified every object capable of bouncing photons. I went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. Upon opening the cabinet, my eyes locked onto the black glass panel of the microwave door. I looked away abruptly, closing the door with my foot. I took a clear glass, but filling it with cold water created a lens. The glass and liquid returned a convex and deformed image of my face. I dropped the glass in the sink. The crash of glass hitting stainless steel echoed in the kitchen, a sharp and painful noise that betrayed my loss of thermodynamic control. I walked toward the hallway. The living room window acted as an immense dark mirror. I walked pressed against the opposite wall, dragging my shoulders against the plaster, lowering my head to avoid looking directly at my own living room, reflected in the nocturnal glass. I was being hunted within my own territory, not by a physical predator, but by the absolute betrayal of optical matter. Paranoia is a parasite that consumes an immense volume of mental calories. Avoiding reflections in a civilized world is a logistically exhausting task. I shunned the polished surface of the metal coffee maker, the screen of the mobile phone lying face up on the table, even the gleam of the bronze door handles. Daily life, structured on mechanized and predictable habits, crumbled. The architecture of inner inner gravity, which kept me anchored and in control of my emotions, suffered critical fissures before the constant and invisible presence of the intruder. Because the most terrifying thing about the broken symmetry is not what you see. It is the crushing certainty, the thermal sensation on the back of the neck, of knowing that when you are not looking at the glass, the entity on the other side is standing there. It is pressed against the silver membrane, watching your back with a predatory and aseptic attention. I returned to the studio. It was the only safe place, or at least the easiest to control. The acoustic curtains were closed, blocking the windows. I turned off the secondary monitor completely, turned it toward the wall, and covered its surface with a towel. The main monitor, with its tracks and grey blocks, was the only bright thing in the room. But being saturated with information and color, it did not possess the blackness necessary to reflect my image. I sat down again. The silence of isolation, which was once a tool to sharpen my consciousness and densify my spirit, now felt like the expectant silence that precedes an execution. I tried to resume work. I selected an audio block, applied a surgical equalizer, and tried to isolate a resonant frequency that muddied the mix. My fingers moved over the keyboard with nervous speed, trying to convince the universe and myself that everything was still in its place. But concentration was impossible. The barometric tension in the room was unbearable. My nervous system screamed that I was cornered. A human being can isolate themselves from the external biomass. One can amputate the parasite of social validation, close the door to the hysterical noise of the crowd, and survive in the vastness of tactical solitude. The monarch isolates himself to govern himself without interference, but how do you isolate yourself when the threat, the hostile and alien interference, has managed to infiltrate the only element you cannot leave outside the vault? How do you hide from your own geometry, from the image that confirms you exist? Fatigue finally began to break my physical resistance. I had been without sleep for more than 24 hours. My eyelids felt like lead plates. Classical logic, exhausted by the effort of denying the obvious, began to give in. Perhaps, I thought in a burst of quantum despair, if I faced the aberration, if I looked directly at the optical abyss and applied the force of my charged immobility, the anomaly would collapse. Perhaps my fear was the only fuel keeping the entity in the glass alive. If I proved to it that my mass was superior, the wave function would stabilize and the reflection would be a slave to photons again. I had to perform an empirical check, a confrontation. Slowly, I stopped the playback of the audio sequencer. The deep hum of the computer and the faint spin of the fans remained as the only living sound in the armored room. I stood up. My joints creaked. I walked toward the secondary monitor I had covered. I extended my right hand. My fingers trembled slightly. I grabbed the edge of the cotton cloth. With a sharp and violent movement, I ripped the towel away and turned the black plastic screen toward me. The liquid crystal, off and polished, absorbed the little light in the room. I stood before it, anchoring my feet. I forced my diaphragm to inhale in a deep and slow manner. I fixed my gaze directly on the dark and diffuse face inhabiting the center of the black rectangle. I remained completely motionless, a pillar of salt before the precipice. The reflection returned the gaze. Its immovability was identical to mine. I observed the contour of the shoulders, the tilt of the skull, the tension in the jaw. I looked for the latency. I looked for the glitch in the matrix. I looked for the millisecond of delay that had unleashed hell hours ago in the bathroom. I waited 10 seconds. 30. A whole minute without blinking. I felt the lactic acid burning in my tensed muscles. Nothing. The reflection was perfect. An exact, obedient, and mechanically precise copy of my posture. I exhaled a long and shaky sigh, feeling the block of ice pressing my chest begin to melt. A weak, pathetic, and nervous smile appeared on my lips. It was a triumph of classical physics. The anomaly had been a creation of my own exhausted mind. A temporary short circuit of stress. The universe made sense again. Optical symmetry worked under the rules of thermodynamics. I was safe. I was alone in my sanctuary of low frequency. I raised my left hand to rub my face, ready to turn off the equipment and go to sleep, finally yielding to physical collapse. It was then that the entity on the other side of the off-screen decided that the game of imitation was over. I raised my left hand, but the dark and diffuse face did not raise its right arm. The face inhabiting the inside of the off-monitor did not raise its arm to imitate me. The reflection lowered its chin slightly, like someone greeting a defeated rival, and in the aseptic darkness of the crystal screen, it sketched a slow, cold, and absolutely independent smile that I was not drawing on my own face. The symmetry had not broken by mistake. It had broken because the entity, with terrifying patience, had decided to let me know that the siege was just beginning, and that the impregnable sanctuary of my solitude had just been invaded from within. Chapter 2: The Observer Effect. In quantum mechanics, there is a fundamental principle, a postulate that has unsettled theoretical physicists for nearly a century and destroys the illusion of an objective universe, the observer effect. The famous double-slit experiment empirically proved that a subatomic particle behaves like a wave of infinite probabilities. It exists in multiple places at the same time, in a state of ghostly superposition. However, at the exact millisecond that a measuring instrument or a human eye fixes upon it to observe its trajectory, the wave function collapses. The particle abandons its state of multiplicity and is forced to choose a spatial coordinate. It begins to behave like a physical, solid, and predictable object. In other words, matter knows when it is being observed and alters its behavior to feign normalcy before the spectator. Until that Tuesday morning, I believed that this phenomenon was strictly confined to the microscopic and distant realm of the subatomic. But the aseptic, slow and macabre smile that formed on the dark face of my own reflection, trapped in the liquid crystal of the off-monitor, proved to me that quantum horror had crossed the border into the macroscopic world. The collapse of my own sanity was instantaneous. My tactical immobility disintegrated. The geometric density I had worked so hard to build through isolation shattered like a glass structure hit by a ballistic projectile. There was no scream. True terror, the absolute panic that threatens to disconnect the central nervous system, rarely produces sound. It is a silent suffocation. I stumbled back. I hit the edge of the desk with my hip. The sharp pain in the pelvic bone was the only physical anchor that prevented me from fainting. My breathing, which minutes before operated at a controlled, frozen, sub-bass frequency, transformed into a shallow and pathetic gasp, the typical heart rate of a cornered prey. I did not take my eyes off the screen. I couldn't. Mammalian instinct screamed that if I turned my back on the aberration, it would cross the plastic and glass membrane to materialize in my studio. The smile on the reflection faded slowly, returning to the cold expressionlessness that simulated my own terrified face. The entity had dictated its message, and immediately after had restored the optical symmetry to mock my disbelief. I walked backward, dragging my feet over the acoustic carpet, until I hit the doorframe. I left the studio walking backward, closed the door with a violent slam, and stayed in the hallway, breathing the dark. The rest of the night was nothing more than a purgatory of hypervigilance. I took refuge in the exact center of the living room, sitting on the floor with my back against the sofa. I refused to turn on the main lamps. The shadows cast by streetlights filtered through the blinds, drawing static lines on the carpet. I was surrounded by objects that until a few hours ago I considered harmless, but which now revealed themselves as potential doors. The television screen, the coffee table glass, the dark oven panel in the open kitchen. Every polished surface in the room had the thermodynamic potential to house the intruder. Dawn broke. The grayish and aseptic light of morning penetrated the apartment, revealing the geography of my prison. Extreme exhaustion operated like a toxin in my blood, but the brain flatly refused to turn off the alert systems. To close one's eyes was equivalent to ceasing to be the observer. If the observer disappeared, what prevented the entity from moving freely? I stood up with geological slowness. My joints ached from the accumulated tension. I decided I needed caffeine, a chemical stimulant to force my synapses to maintain the firewall against madness. I walked toward the kitchen with my gaze fixed. I stared rigidly at the matte floor tiles, avoiding the bright geometry of the appliances. I took a porous ceramic mug. I avoided glass. I filled the Italian mocha pot by feeling the metallic edges without looking at them directly, guided by muscle memory. I turned on the stove and waited for the bubbling. I listened to the mechanical bubbling of the boiling water, a classic, predictable, reassuring sound. I served the black, steaming coffee. I opened the silverware drawer and took out a stainless steel teaspoon to stir the sugar. It was a reflex act, an unforgivable calculation error dictated by routine. As the spoon turned in the dark liquid, creating a small centripetal vortex, my gaze fell upon the concave surface of the metal. In optical physics, a polished steel spoon acts as a spherical mirror that inverts the image. I saw my distorted and upside-down face in the curve of the metal. But the terror did not come from the deformity of the refraction, but from the stasis. The spoon was turning. My hand was moving in rapid circles. The liquid was rotating. However, in the microscopic reflection of the steel, the inverted face was absolutely still. Its eyes were tiny black dots fixed on me. Those eyes challenged the inertia of motion. I dropped the spoon. It fell into the cup, splashing boiling coffee onto my wrist. The physical pain was sharp, but I didn't even blink. I took a step back. The teaspoon protruded from the dark liquid. The reflection on the handle of the utensil had been restored. It now showed the white ceiling of the kitchen, obeying once again the laws of light. Optical panic spread through my nervous system like a forest fire. The glitch in the mirror was not confined to large glass panels. The entity did not need a full-body frame to invade my perimeter. Any surface capable of bouncing photons, however tiny or convex, was an observation post. The infection was total. The thermal sensation of being watched is a biological phenomenon both fascinating and terrifying. Conventional science tries to explain it as hyperactivity of the cerebral amygdala. It is seen as an evolutionary byproduct designed to detect predators hidden in the periphery of our vision. It manifests physically as a drastic drop in the temperature of the neck, a bristling of the hair follicles on the arms, and an almost solid atmospheric pressure that oppresses the ribcage. Throughout that Wednesday, I walked through my own home enduring that invisible radiation. The observer effect had been macabrelly inverted. I was no longer the researcher forcing the particle to collapse with my gaze. I was the object of study on a three-dimensional petri dish. I began to notice the patterns. The entity operated under a strict, though sadistic, thermodynamic code of conduct. When I looked directly, with focused and direct vision, at any reflective surface, whether it was the bathroom mirror, the studio monitor, or a window, the symmetry remained intact. The reflection abided by the laws of optics. I would raise my hand, and the reflection would raise it. I would blink, and the reflection would blink simultaneously. The intruder feigned being a simple physical phenomenon of light bounce, playing its part with millimetric perfection. It knew that under the magnifying glass of my direct gaze, the wave function had to collapse. But the anomaly thrived in the margins, in the blind spots, in the periphery. I proved it in the mid-afternoon. I was in the hallway, in front of the entrance door. The lock knob was a polished brass sphere, worn by years but bright enough to return a golden and spherical image of the surroundings. I stood 1 meter away, looking directly at the wood of the door, but concentrating all my neuronal capacity on peripheral vision, using the retinal rods designed to detect movement in low light. I held my body in a charged immobility. I did not breathe. In the brass sphere, my reflection stood at the limit of my vision. I was still. But in the brass, the golden silhouette began to slowly raise its right arm, pointing toward me. I turned my head with explosive violence, pinning my direct vision on the doorknob. Clack! The delay was perhaps 300 milliseconds. In that fraction of time, I saw the reflected arm fall. It fell at the speed of light, desperately coupling itself to the real posture of my body, like an actor caught out of position on stage, trying to adopt his pose before the curtain rises. The empirical confirmation of this behavior did not mitigate my terror. It multiplied it by a cosmic factor. The entity was not a simple random glitch of physics. It possessed tactical intelligence. It possessed an agenda. The reflection was not stalking me to scare me like a cheap movie poltergeist. Its objective was infinitely more clinical and predatory. It was studying me. It took advantage of every second. It used every second in which my attention was not focused on it to observe my body language, measure my center of gravity, analyze the tension of my muscles, and memorize the rhythmic patterns of my breathing. It wanted to understand my mass. It was calibrating its own software in the image and likeness of my hardware. What did it plan to do once it managed to imitate my density to perfection? Tactical isolation, the extreme solitude that was once my greatest source of power, had become a deadly trap. I had built a low-frequency sanctuary to isolate myself from the external biomass so that no one would drain my energy. But by amputating my social links, by locking the doors and turning off the phone, I had voluntarily locked myself in an aseptic chamber alone with an intruder who did not need to breathe oxygen. I headed back to the living room, dragging my feet, consumed by paranoia. Sunset began to tint the sky. It dyed the city sky orange, casting long and disturbing shadows on the walls. The waning light was the prelude to an even greater horror. With darkness, the window glass would lose its transparency to become immense dark mirrors, giant screens where the entity would have total freedom to operate. Physical and mental exhaustion reached a critical breaking point. My brain demanded a system shutdown. Microsleeps began to assault me while I was standing. My head would fall forward and I would wake up startled milliseconds later, heart racing. I needed to sleep or I would die from neurological collapse. But the geometric equation of sleep revealed an unbearable truth. To sleep implied closing the eyes. It implied disconnecting the retinas, the only quantum measuring instrument that kept the entity bound to the laws of imitation. If the intruder only respected symmetry when I was watching directly, what then? If it used my peripheral vision to move freely, what would it do when my consciousness turned off completely for 8 hours? If the observer disappeared from the equation, the wave function would be free. I imagined my inert body on the bed. I imagined the immense mirror of the wardrobe. I visualized the darkness of the room and, in my exhausted mind, I saw the figure in the glass slowly approach the silver surface while I snored, unaware of the danger. I saw it press its identical face against the cold barrier of the glass, studying the fragility of my exposed throat. It was waiting for the exact thermodynamic moment to execute the next phase of its invasion. I dropped onto the sofa, covering my face with both hands. The silence of the apartment weighed on my chest like a granite slab. Solitude, my former crown, was now the crushing weight of the invisible. I could not flee. I could not call anyone because the ordinary biomass would diagnose my terror as a psychotic break and lock me in a room full of observation mirrors. I was irremediably alone against an anomaly that knew me better than I knew myself. And as the last ray of sun disappeared, I understood. Darkness turned the television, the glass table, and the windows into dark and expectant portals. I understood that the asymmetric war had begun, and that my adversary never needed to sleep. Chapter 3: The Reverse of Matter. Sleep deprivation is not simply a state of tiredness. In the forensic physics of the human mind, it is an accelerated process of entropic disintegration. When the mammalian brain is forced to stay on beyond its biological limits, the barrier separating logical reasoning from psychosis begins to become permeable. Forced wakefulness consumes a monstrous volume of mental calories. At 48 hours without closing your eyes, the three-dimensional world loses its sharpness. Sounds become metallic, the perception of time dilates in an agonizing latency, and gravity seems to multiply, crushing the ribcage against the floor. I survived Wednesday night entrenched in the geometric center of my living room, my back pressed rigidly against the wall furthest from any window. I did not allow myself a single prolonged blink. I held my consciousness with the brutality of a dictator clinging to the throne during a siege. When the ashen and aseptic light of dawn finally filtered through the blinds, illuminating the suspended dust, I knew I had won a tiny, pathetic, and Pyrrhic battle. I had survived the darkness, yes, but the entity on the other side of the glass possessed a devastating thermodynamic advantage. It did not suffer from cellular fatigue. Its patience was mathematical, inorganic, and infinite. I stood up. My knees creaked with a dry sound. The pain in my muscles was the only empirical proof that I still inhabited a physical body. I understood that fleeing from reflections and hiding my gaze on the floor was the tactic of a prey. It was the cowardly strategy of the ordinary biomass. If I intended to regain absolute control of my ecosystem and preserve my sovereignty, I could not limit myself to evading the anomaly. I had to dissect it. I had to drag the abomination from the realm of the supernatural to the autopsy table of theoretical physics. I walked toward my studio. This space was my acoustic fortress, and now it had to become my quantum laboratory. I turned on the computer, making sure to keep my gaze strictly fixed on the matte keyboard and the illuminated areas of the screen, avoiding the black frame of polished plastic. I began an obsessive investigation. My fingers hit the mechanical keys with a calculated violence. If that being was not a ghost, an absurd and insulting concept for any rational mind, then it had to obey some extreme and undocumented law of the mechanics of the universe. I needed to understand the exact architecture. I needed to understand the boundary that separated us. I needed to understand the physics of the glass. I filled the screen with optical diagrams, treatises on particle physics, and articles on CPT symmetry, charge, parity, and time. I read about how photons travel through space until they hit the surface of a mirror. In an ordinary mirror, composed of a sheet of glass protecting a microscopic layer of silver or aluminum, the free electrons of the metal interact with the electromagnetic field of the incident photon, cancelling it and emitting a new photon with the same energy but in the opposite direction. That is the official explanation, the comfortable lie that science packages to reassure the masses. A simple mechanical bounce. But as I delved into the geometry of space-time and the chirality of matter, a terrifying hypothesis began to crystallize in my exhausted brain. In chemistry and physics, chirality describes objects. It describes objects that are not superimposable on their mirror image, like the left hand and the right hand. Our universe is dominated by left-handed matter at the subatomic level. There is a fundamental asymmetry in creation. What would happen if the mirror is not simply a photon bouncer? What would happen if the layer of silver nitrate, under certain extreme conditions of density and observation, does not reflect the light of this universe, but acts as a semi-permeable quantum membrane that connects us directly to a universe of inverted parity? A right-handed universe, an exact reverse of matter. If that premise was correct, the image we see daily in the bathroom is not a trick of light. It is a window to an adjacent thermodynamic ecosystem inhabited by entities composed of antimatter or inverted matter, which are gravitationally synchronized with us. For millennia, those entities were forced to imitate us. They were forced because the pressure of observation, the collapse of the wave function from our side of the membrane, kept them bound to symmetry. They were slaves to our gaze. But something had broken in my ecosystem. By isolating myself from society, I had altered the barometric pressure of my reality. By amputating my links with the noise of the world, by forging my conscious matter and massively increasing the density of my inner gravity, I had changed everything. I had accumulated so much potential energy in my extreme solitude that the membrane of the mirror had begun to give way under the weight of my existence. And the entity inhabiting the other side, my exact counterpart in the reverse of matter, had awakened. It had felt the fissure. It had discovered that the tyrant who forced it to imitate every movement was blinking, doubting, and bleeding with terror. I stopped reading. The hum of the computer processor seemed to fill the entire auditory spectrum of the room. If my theory was true, the entity did not want to scare me. Fear was only a byproduct. What the entity desired, with a mathematical and frigid veracity, was the control of the anchor. It wanted to use the break in symmetry to transfer its mass toward my side of the membrane, or worse, it wanted to invert the polarities. It wanted to usurp my sovereignty in the physical plane and lock me in the two-dimensional vacuum, condemning me to be the slave who imitates movements from the other side forever. Terror gave way to a cold, aseptic, and sub-base fury. I had sacrificed too much to reach my tactical immunity. I had destroyed my relationships. I had endured the pain of social amputation, and I had looked my own demons in the eye without blinking. I was not going to let an optical parasite take my throne. I would not let a miserable inverted reflection composed of stolen photons snatch the throne of my own empire. I had to perform a controlled experiment. If the war was asymmetric, I would impose the battlefield. I got up from the desk. I went to the bathroom, keeping my gaze fixed on the hallway baseboard. I opened the medicine cabinet with my eyes half closed and extracted a small hand mirror, a frameless glass rectangle of barely 15 by 10 centimeters. It was a manageable surface, a tactical peephole that I could cover with the palm of my hand in any millisecond if the experiment got out of control. I returned to the studio. I sat in my ergonomic chair and placed the small mirror face down on the matte wooden table next to the keyboard. I turned off the two monitors. The only light source in the acoustic room came from a small halogen desk lamp, which cast a raw and direct beam on the table. The rest of the room was left in an oppressive and absolute darkness. I breathed deeply. I executed the protocol of charged immobility. I anchored my feet to the floor, forcing gravity through my shins. I relaxed my shoulders. I reduced my heart rate through long and controlled exhalations. I was trying to stabilize my internal barometry. I was the monarch. I was the observer who forced the wave function to collapse. I had the critical mass. I reached out my right hand and with a sharp movement flipped the hand mirror over, leaving it face up under the halogen light. I leaned slightly forward, framing only my face in the glass rectangle. The raw light revealed my haggard features. My eyes, bloodshot from lack of sleep, stared back at my own reflection. Everything seemed to be in order. Optical symmetry remained obedient under the dictatorship of my direct observation. I blinked slowly. The reflection blinked in unison. I tilted my head 1 millimeter to the left. The reflection obeyed the order without apparent latency. But I knew the obedience was a sham. "I know what you are," I whispered. My voice sounded raspy, dense, immediately absorbed by the acoustic panels. I did not expect the reflection to answer me acoustically. Sound needs air to propagate, and in the reverse of matter, there is no oxygen, only the cold geometry of inverted light. I kept my gaze fixed on its pupils inside the glass. I offered it not a single trace of fear. I used the technique of ocular suffocation, holding eye contact without blinking, applying all the crushing weight of my presence. I wanted to force it to make a mistake. I wanted to prove to it that I was the object of greater gravitational mass and that it was condemned to orbit under my laws. The passage of time became distorted. The seconds fell heavily like drops of lead on a drum. 20 seconds, 40 seconds, a whole minute. My eyes burned, demanding lubrication, but my iron will refused to close the eyelids. And then, in the second minute of confrontation, the reverse of matter manifested. The aberration was not a sudden movement or a vulgar scare. It was a subtle, majestic, and supremely arrogant anatomical alteration. I was leaning forward, with my shoulders tense and hunched from the fatigue of almost 50 hours without sleep. My breathing was visible in my clavicles. I was a human being on the edge of biological collapse. However, the image inside the small rectangular mirror began to correct itself autonomously. Slowly and fluidly, as if gravity in its universe had ceased to exist, the reflection corrected its posture, its shoulders straightened with military discipline. Its shoulders, which should have been hunched like mine, pulled back and straightened with impeccable discipline. Its neck stood tall. The expression of chronic fatigue that dominated my real face completely disappeared in the glass. The intruder's skin seemed tighter, younger, devoid of the dark circles. The reflection ceased to be a copy of my current state, to become an optimized, superior, and terrifying version of myself. I froze. My chest rose and fell with agitated breathing, prey to hyperventilation, but the chest of the entity in the mirror was absolutely motionless. It demonstrated a perfect and lethal charged immobility, infinitely superior to the one I had managed to forge in my weeks of isolation. The entity tilted its head slightly, observing me from its side of the membrane with a mixture of clinical pity and aristocratic contempt. Its eyes were not mine. His possessed an inscrutable quantum density, the aseptic gaze of a forensic doctor examining a necrosed organ on a steel table. I was the weak biomass. He was the monarch. The thermodynamic humiliation I experienced in that millisecond shattered all my logical defenses. The intruder was not imitating me poorly due to a calculation error. It was showing me deliberately that I was the inferior organism. My fatigue, my paranoia, and my terror had stripped me of all critical mass, while he, in the cold vacuum of his specular universe, had assimilated all the energy. I raised my right hand, trembling violently, intending to cover the glass and abort the experiment. The entity in the mirror did not raise its hand to imitate me. Instead, as my palm descended toward the surface of the glass to cover it, the reflection raised its own right hand. It raised its right hand, my visual left, brought it to its face, and with a sadistic and calculated slowness, placed its index finger to its lips, ordering me to keep silent. The contact of my warm, sweaty palm against the cold glass produced a dull thud. I covered the surface completely. I closed the quantum window. I dragged the chair back, fleeing from the desk. I hugged my knees, curled up in the acoustic darkness of my studio, while my belief system was reduced to smoking ashes. The reverse of matter had established its terms. It was no longer a parasite spying from the shadows. It had revealed itself as the architect of an imminent invasion. It had shown it was not limited by my will or the laws of my universe. It possessed its own inner gravity, a centripetal force so monstrous that I began to feel sucked toward the polished surface of the glass. I felt as if my own three-dimensional reality were losing density against the absolute perfection of the reverse. And while cold sweat ran down my back, and the halogen light illuminated only the back of my hand pressed against the mirror, a new and lethal certainty settled in my brain. The entity was not going to settle for observing me, or imitating me, or mocking my weakness. The entity had dictated the order of silence because it was preparing to cross the membrane. It was ready for the first physical transgression, and I, isolated, had guaranteed that no one would rescue the prey. Chapter 4. The First Transgression. The human mind, when subjected to a barometric pressure of absolute terror, tends to shrink, to seek refuge in denial, and to beg that the laws of the material universe function once again under the comforting mediocrity of classical physics. After covering that small hand mirror, I spent the following hours curled up in the corner. I had become frightened biomass, a fragmented organism retreating before the overwhelming immensity of a quantum predator. But the tactical isolation I had practiced for so long did not allow for the survival of cowardice. In the aseptic darkness of my L-shaped room, cold and calculating reason began to prevail over reptilian panic. The geometric design of this space, which I had acoustically treated to annihilate high frequencies, reminded me that I was the architect of my environment. I was the conscious matter. To flee from the crystals and cover the monitors was to accept thermodynamic defeat. It was to cede the throne and the control to a parasitic anomaly. If the reflection had decided to break the optical symmetry, if the entity had decided to stop imitating my movements to demonstrate its superiority, I could not respond by hiding in the shadows. I had to force the machinery. I had to bring the experiment to a total, undeniable, and macroscopic scale. I needed a testing field. I stood up. My joints ached, and the lack of sleep wrapped my perception in a dense fog. But my will now operated under the implacable force of charged immobility. I walked toward the hallway with a straight gaze, ignoring the glints on the doorknobs and windows. I headed to the master bedroom. There, a heavy mirror rested. It was a full-length mirror, a perfect rectangle of beveled glass almost 2 meters high. I grabbed it by the solid wood edges. It weighed a great deal, an inert mass subject to the gravity of this side of the universe. I dragged it across the floor into my studio. I positioned it strategically in the center of the L. It stood upright, flanked by the heavy audio monitors and the desk. To my left, my computer tower worked in a deep, continuous whisper. It was a machine built to handle the massive load of music production. Its 8-core Ryzen processor and 32 gigabytes of RAM operated in perfect synchrony. It was a triumph of logic. The mirror, however, rose before me like a black and expectant monolith, a vertical abyss that cut the acoustics of the room. I turned off the main lights. The studio was plunged into twilight, illuminated only by the residual light from the screens and the metallic glow of my audio interface. I needed an anchor. The visual confrontation I was about to unleash required a thermodynamic anchor to prevent my nervous system from collapsing completely. I opened my main audio sequencer. With the fluidity of muscle memory forged in thousands of hours of tactical isolation, I loaded an oscillator. I set the frequency to 40 Hz. A sub-bass hum, massive, pure and unshakable, flooded the L-shaped room. The frequency was so deep it was perceived directly in the spinal cord. It vibrated the sternum and the cerebrospinal fluid. The acoustic treatment of the walls absorbed any sharp harmonics, leaving only that raw and heavy barometric pressure. That sustained note was my electromagnetic shield. While that sub-bass vibrated in my chest, I would remain tied to the laws of three-dimensional physics. I stood exactly 1.5 meters from the full-length mirror. I anchored my feet to the floor. I straightened my back to project the maximum density possible. I fixed my gaze directly on the polished silver surface. The reflection was there, full length, immersed in the same twilight of the room, surrounded by the inverted image of my monitors and equipment. The man in the glass returned my gaze with an aseptic, exhausted expression, identical to mine. I breathed deeply. I felt the oxygen expand my diaphragm in perfect synchrony with the sub-bass hum. The reflection imitated the breath. His chest rose and fell without the slightest latency. I began the calibration protocol, mechanical, slow and deliberate movements to test the elasticity of the quantum membrane. I raised my right arm. The reflection raised its visual left arm with geometric precision. I lowered it. It followed. I turned my neck. It obeyed. I maintained ocular suffocation at all times, watching its pupils through the glass, looking for any micro-expression of independence, any failure in the representation of matter. The optical symmetry was impeccable. Whoever the entity was on the other side, it was abiding by the laws of particle physics. It was playing at being a simple photon bounce. The observer effect was forcing the anomaly to behave like an inert phenomenon. But I knew it was a sham. I had seen its smile. I knew the quantum beast was crouching, waiting for a moment of weakness, or for terror to make me blink. I decided to increase the thermodynamic friction. If the entity wanted to imitate my mass, it would have to process kinetic information at high speed. I began to execute a series of rapid, erratic, and asymmetric movements. I raised both hands, touched my face, took a quick sidestep, leaned slightly, and stood back up. My heart rate quickened, breaking the calm of the sub-bass. The reflection followed me. It moved with the speed of light, no matter how sudden my movement was. The synchronization was so perfect that I almost doubted. My logical mind tried to convince me that the horror had been a hallucination induced by lack of sleep. It tried to whisper that the mirror was just a mirror. I stopped. I returned to the starting position with firm feet and relaxed arms. My chest rose and fell rhythmically. The reflection stopped with me. The tension in the L-shaped room was so thick it made breathing difficult. The constant hum of the 40 Hz seemed to push the air against the glass. Then, without warning, without any visible muscular preparation and completely breaking my own behavior pattern, I executed the transgression. I launched my right hand forward with extreme violence, fingers clawed, pointing directly at the reflection's eyes, while emitting a guttural and dull scream from the bottom of my diaphragm. It was an explosive movement, a burst of raw and animal kinetic energy. The universe stopped. The laws of optics and sanity disintegrated. I was there, frozen in my attack position, my right arm extended forward, muscles in maximum tension, face contracted by aggressiveness, chest leaning aggressively toward the glass. But the reflection had not followed me. The entity in the mirror had not raised its arm. It had not contracted its face. The man on the other side of the 2-meter-high glass remained standing, upright, in the exact position of rest I had milliseconds before the attack. His arms hung relaxed and loose at his sides. His posture radiated a massive immovability, an aristocratic and aseptic calm that crushed me against reality. The desynchronization was now absolute, macroscopic, and sustained. It was no longer a small peripheral failure. It was a declaration of physical independence before my own eyes. My arm remained extended in the air, trembling from excess adrenaline. My breathing had stopped completely. The entity observed me. The asymmetry was so violent, so inherently unnatural, that my reptilian brain entered a catastrophic short circuit. I felt nausea. An oppressive vertigo invaded me, as if the gravity of the earth had suddenly inverted, and I was about to fall upward toward the black ceiling of the studio. Slowly, trembling with panic, I lowered my right arm. I let it fall to my side, returning to the resting posture. The entity did not move. It didn't need to. It was already in that position. And then, in the absolute silence, the reverse of matter executed its own movement, a movement I was not performing. The reflection raised its chin a couple of centimeters, exhibiting a posture of absolute sovereignty. Its eyes, which now housed an ancient and alien quantum density, scanned me from top to bottom, evaluating my terror. Then, its lips curved into a smile. It was not a cheap movie grimace. It was a smile of compassionate and ruthless understanding, the smile of an experienced surgeon observing a terminal patient who has just realized there is no cure. It was the smile of tactical immunity. I backed away a step. The reflection did not move. It stayed there, smiling, watching my empire crumble. The first transgression had been consummated. The pact of light had been annihilated. The mirror was no longer a reflective surface. It had transformed into a permeable membrane, a one-way observation window where I was the specimen in the cage, and the entity was the scientist about to introduce the scalpel. I stayed pressed against the back wall, hyperventilating, unable to look away from that being that wore my face and clothing. The hum of 40 hertz still filled the room, but it no longer anchored me to reality. It anchored me to the unbearable horror of knowing I was not alone in the room. The doorway for the invader required no locks, no wood, and no steel. It only required light. Chapter 5. Tactical Isolation. Light is the great traitor of the universe. Since the beginning of time, humanity has associated darkness with terror and light with security, truth, and revelation. The ordinary biomass turns on lamps to drive away monsters, naively believing that photons are an electromagnetic shield against the unknown and the unseen. But in the physics of the quantum invasion I was experiencing, light was not a shield, it was the bridge, the information highway, the very blood that fed the predator. My reflection, that majestic, cold and aseptic invader who had just smiled at me from the other side of the glass membrane, depended purely on optics. It depended exclusively on optics to anchor itself to my reality. If the glass was the doorframe, photons were the lock and the key. As long as there was light bouncing off the polished surfaces of my apartment, the bidirectional communication channel would remain open. If I could see him, the equation dictated he could see me. And if he was seeing me, he was studying me, scanning my weakness, calibrating my mass, and preparing the ground for physical intrusion. Panic is an expansive gas that destroys the intellect, but tactical survival demands compressing that gas into a lethal and directed fuel. I understood the only viable defense was amputation. I had to execute a protocol of total tactical isolation. I had to blind him. And to blind him, I had to blind myself. The first strategic objective was the black monolith in front of me, the full-length mirror. Detaching myself from the wall required a superhuman effort of will. My brain screamed that approaching was suicide. But the monarch does not flee. The monarch imposes his laws. I maintained ocular suffocation. I did not turn my eyes away from the dark and quantum pupils of the entity. His eyes followed me, recording my fear with an analytical indifference that chilled my blood. To my right, a heavy industrial acoustic blanket was hung. It was a dense black fabric, filled with fiberglass, and designed to absorb low-frequency sound. It weighed nearly 10 kilograms and was mathematically opaque. It did not allow a single photon to pass. I reached out my arm, without looking away from the intruder in the glass, and grabbed the edge of the blanket. I pulled it with a sharp violence, ripping it from its supports. The sound of the Velcro tearing rang out like a gunshot in the dead acoustics of the L-shaped room. The entity in the mirror did not flinch. He did not try to imitate my aggressive movement or show surprise. He simply watched me raise that heavy shroud, his compassionate smile accentuated by a millimeter. He knew what I was going to do, and his body language radiated the arrogance of one who knows that blindfolding the jailer does not destroy the cell. With a guttural cry to expel the excess carbon dioxide, I threw the acoustic blanket over the mirror. The heavy fabric hit the glass with a dull thud, slipped a few centimeters, and caught on the wooden edges, covering the reflective surface completely. The optical connection was cut in an instant. The face of the entity and his alien smile were annihilated under 10 kilograms of fiberglass and black cloth. I breathed. Air entered my lungs with painful friction. The 40 hertz hum still emanated from the speakers, but the barometric pressure in the room had changed. The black hole had been covered. However, the victory was microscopic. Covering the main mirror was like closing the main door of a broken castle. The entire apartment was a minefield of potential optics. The purge began, a tactical quarantine executed with the paranoid efficiency of a bomb disposal squad. I left the studio and entered the hallway. I turned off all artificial lights. Sunset had given way to the deep night of the city. The only lighting came from orange streetlights filtering through the windows. The windows. Those immense glass rectangles had become dark mirrors at night due to the luminance difference. I walked crouched, keeping my center of gravity low, avoiding the living room windows. I dragged the heavy furniture. I lowered the aluminum blinds to the bottom, ensuring the slats fit perfectly, blocking any street reflection. Then, I drew the heavy opaque velvet curtains and closed them tightly, sealing the outer perimeter with metal clips to not leave a single crack where the reverse of matter could peer through. The darkness in the apartment began to thicken. It became tactile. I went to the kitchen. The terror there was microscopic and multiplicative. Oven doors, stainless steel, the microwave screen. I extracted 3 rolls of industrial-grade duct tape and a giant roll of thick aluminum foil. I neutralized. I stuck thick strips of tape over the microwave display. I unscrewed the bulbs of the hood and taped opaque newspaper over the black polished induction cooktop. I covered the front of the dishwasher and the fridge. My hands moved with a frenetic speed, a frenzy driven by the toxic adrenaline in my veins. Every time I passed near a reflective object, I felt a thermal itch on my neck, the gravitational pressure of an external gaze trying to break through. I did not look at my own hands. I did not look at the surface while I covered it. I did it all guided by touch, closing the entry ports one by one. I went to the bathroom, the place of the first fracture. I entered with my eyes squeezed shut so tightly, I saw phosphine sparks. I moved by touch, brushing the cold tiles with my fingertips until I felt the beveled edge of the mirror. I had a large towel. I deployed it blindly and taped it to the glass. I pressed the edges hard, sealing the glass under the fabric. When I opened my eyes, the mirror no longer existed. There was only a square of grey cloth on the wall. The work lasted more than 3 hours, 3 hours of systematic visual amputation. I covered the TV screen with a sheet. I hid all metallic kitchen utensils inside an opaque cloth bag and put them at the back of the lowest drawer. I covered glass photo frames. I turned the wristwatches over. Finally, I returned to the studio. The acoustic blanket still covered the full-length mirror. The cloth had not moved. But I knew that, behind that fabric, the entity was still there, with eyes open in the dark, pressed to the glass, waiting. I turned off the computer monitors by disconnecting them from the power to kill even the residual reflection. I threw the cables to the floor. I turned off the 40 Hz hum. Then I executed the final step of the tactical isolation protocol. I went to the fuse box in the hallway, and with a sharp flick of my wrist, I flipped the main switch. The entire apartment plunged into a mathematical, absolute, and abyssal darkness. A total thermodynamic blackout. I sat on the floor, at the intersection of the hallway and the living room, crossing my legs in a lotus position. I leaned my head against the wall. The silence and the blackness were so pure that I lost the notion of geometry. My eyes tried to manufacture images from neuronal static, creating grey clouds. I had created a sensory deprivation chamber on an architectural scale. Tactical isolation was complete. By annihilating every light source and covering every reflective surface, I had blinded the reverse of matter. I had cut the transmission bridge. I had erased the coordinates of my universe. For the first time in 3 days, the racing of my heart began to subside. Breathing became deeper and slower, returning to the sub-bass frequency of charged rest. I smiled in the dark, a dry, cracked smile, but charged with undeniable arrogance. I had regained sovereignty. The monarch had closed the vault doors, and no quantum aberration was going to violate my territory while I controlled the lighting. I was the master of the photons. If the material universe required friction to exist, I had just eliminated the elastic medium. I closed my eyes, ready for sleep. I needed my cells to regenerate. I needed to build my critical mass. But the cosmos does not allow total invulnerability. Closing a door in one plane simply diverts the pressure toward the point of least resistance. I sat in the deepest darkness. My retinas rested. My neck muscles began to loosen. The apartment was buried in a strict silence. that dense silence achieved only in an acoustically treated environment where frequencies die instantly. And it was precisely in that acoustic perfection that the new transgression materialized. I had blinded the entity, yes. I had blocked the optics. But optics is only one of the wave frequencies that connect matter. By eliminating light, I had sharpened my other senses exponentially. My auditory cortex amplified its gain to the maximum, calibrated to detect the slightest disturbance. About 20 minutes of darkness passed. Then, I heard it. It was not a loud noise, it was not the wood settling or the distant traffic. It was a dry sound, pure friction, the sound of fabric dragging millimetrically against a smooth surface. I snapped my eyes open in the total darkness. My pulse spiked, injecting frozen adrenaline into my heart. The sound came from my studio at the end of the hallway. There were no drafts in the apartment. The ventilation was off. The windows were sealed. There was absolutely no thermodynamic or physical reason for the heavy acoustic blanket covering the mirror to move. But the friction continued. A soft, dull, calculated dragging. Shh, shh. The entity in the reverse of matter did not need light to know where the portal was. It did not need eyes to locate the barrier. If the glass was a membrane, and I had put a blanket on my side, the friction suggested a terrifying impossibility. The entity was touching the fabric from the other side. Tactical visual isolation had failed. I had assumed the intruder was trapped behind solid glass, but the sound of the blanket moving in the dark proved the glass was no longer a physical barrier. It had dissolved into nothingness. Without the restriction of light, without the collapse of the wave function that forced the entity to feign symmetry, the invader was exploring the tactile limits of my world. By plunging the room into blackness, I had not blinded him. I had removed his chains. I had provided the perfect ecosystem. I had provided a blind and mute ecosystem to begin his physical propagation. I sat petrified, eyes wide, trying to pierce the darkness of the hallway while the dragging stopped. It was followed by an aseptic, dull creak on the floor of my studio, as if something infinitely heavy had just stepped out. Chapter 6: Acoustic Propagation. In the hierarchy of human senses, sight is a tool of distance. We require photons to travel from the object to our retinas to decode reality. Sight allows us to be passive observers, remote analysts of a universe that does not necessarily touch us. But sound is a completely different thermodynamic beast. Sound is not electromagnetic radiation traveling through a vacuum. Sound is a mechanical wave. It is pure friction. For a sound to exist and be perceived by the eardrum, it requires an elastic medium. It requires a physical object to strike, move, or compress air molecules, traveling physically to vibrate the bones of your skull. Sound is, by mathematical and biological definition, intimate physical contact. When I sat in the absolute blackness of the hallway, after having executed the total tactical blackout, the rustle of the heavy acoustic blanket and the dry creak of the wood in my studio shattered any illusion of safety. If I could not see the entity, I assumed it could not anchor itself to my dimension. But the creak of the wooden floor proved the lethal fallacy of my reasoning. The entity did not need light to exist. It simply used it to imitate me. By turning off the light, I had not banished it. I had granted it the perfect anonymity. I had given it the perfect cover to cross the membrane and begin to manipulate the molecular matter on my side of the ecosystem. It was compressing the air. It was touching me through the vibrations. I remained petrified, legs crossed on the floor, with my heart pumping thick blood at a rate that threatened to burst my arteries. My vision was neutralized, forcing my auditory cortex to operate at a disproportionate gain. I heard the flow of my own blood. Silence fell once more over the apartment. A strict, heavy silence, but it was no longer an empty silence. It was an occupied silence. The charged immobility I had practiced was being replicated. The invader in the next room was mirroring that massive containment of energy. I was not going to hide in the hallway like frightened biomass, waiting to be devoured in the dark. I was an engineer of conscious matter. If the battlefield had shifted from the electromagnetic spectrum to the mechanical, I had an advantage. I dominated acoustics. I stood up slowly. My joints, stiff from lack of sleep and extreme tension, threatened to betray my position. I took off my shoes, leaving my socks on the wood to silence my footsteps. I walked toward the studio, dragging my feet millimeter by millimeter, using spatial memory to navigate. The studio, that L-shaped room I had designed with clinical obsession, was my true laboratory. I knew its barometric behavior perfectly. Every high-density foam panel, every bass trap placed in the 90-degree corners of the L had a mathematical purpose: to devour reverberation. That room was a dead space. It was an improvised anechoic chamber. A sound emitted there died instantly, without bouncing off the walls. Crossing the threshold of the studio, the atmospheric pressure in my ears changed, becoming dull and heavy. I knew that meters away, in the unfathomable darkness, stood the full-length mirror, covered. I knew that, standing in front of it, or perhaps already walking through the room, was the anomaly. I reached out blindly until I felt the cold metal of my desk. I found the power panel of my computer. I needed my tools, but I could not turn on the monitors and risk creating a new reflective surface. The Ryzen processor started with a deep, almost imperceptible but familiar hum. The computer case, hidden under the desk, emitted a very faint internal LED light, but being boxed in, it generated no reflections in the room. My hand found the audio interface. I turned the switch and activated the phantom power. I had a large diaphragm microphone mounted on an articulated arm, always ready to record. I pulled it toward me in the dark. I turned on the secondary monitor, but kept the brightness at 1%. A ghostly glow, just enough to see the software interface, but insufficient for the black plastic to reflect me. I opened Ableton Live 12. The session loaded in 3 seconds. I was not going to use this software for art. I was going to use it as a military radar of subatomic precision, a frequency scanner to dissect the darkness. I armed the audio track linked to the condenser microphone and put on the heavy headphones. These closed-back studio headphones isolated me acoustically from the room, connecting my eardrums directly to what the super-sensitive microphone capsule captured. At first, I only heard the floor noise, the thermal static of the electronic components, and the muffled hum of my own breathing. I turned up the gain on the audio interface to the limit before it distorted. On the Ableton screen, the input track's waveform began to thicken, recording every fluctuation in the air pressure of the L-shaped room. I remained completely still, holding my breath to focus all my capacity on the auditory channel. The room was recording activity. Through the headphones, the dead acoustics of the studio revealed themselves as an ocean of micro-events. I heard the distant creak of the building's beams. I heard the rustle of my own clothes. But beneath all that, operating at an extremely subtle frequency, I caught a disturbance. They were not footsteps. The entity did not walk. The entity displaced the air. I heard a sibilant sound, similar to a dense gas slowly pressurizing against the acoustically treated walls. On the monitor, the spectrum analyzer showed erratic peaks in the upper mid-frequencies, around 2000 Hz. Someone or something was manipulating the air molecules near the right corner of the L, right where the covered mirror was. I applied a multiband compressor to the master track, squeezing the dynamic range, lifting the inaudible sounds and crushing the peaks to level the volume. I raised the gain. The hiss transformed into something biological, a wet rubbing. Friction. I was listening to the breathing of the reverse of matter. It was a respiratory cycle that did not obey the need for oxygen, but imitated, with sadistic mockery, the cadence of human lungs. It inhaled slowly and exhaled with rhythm. I froze. My instinct demanded I tear off the headphones and run from that cursed apartment. But charged immobility dictated that the monarch does not flee from telemetry. He analyzes it. I was the engineer. I dictated the thermodynamics of sound. If the entity used air to exist, it was subject to my laws. Sound bounced, was absorbed, or resonated. I decided to launch an acoustic probe. I brought the microphone to my lips in the semi-darkness of the monitor at 1% brightness. I needed to emit a physical stimulus to measure its reaction. A dry impulse. "I hear you," I whispered. The consonants hit the microphone diaphragm. In my headphones, the phrase sounded immense, deep, and sharp. At the same time, my real voice traveled through the L-shaped room, hit the foam panels, and, as physical laws dictated, was absorbed immediately. There was no echo, no reverberation. The room swallowed my words. I waited. The spectrum analyzer on the screen traced a flat line of silence. And then, the laws of acoustic propagation fractured into 1,000 pieces. 15 seconds after my whisper, when the energy of my voice had already been converted into heat and vanished, the room replied. But it was not a response coming from the microphone. It was not in my headphones. I tore off the headband violently, leaving my ears bare to the heavy air of the studio. From the opposite wall, from the thick panels that should kill sound, an unnatural, impossible and delayed echo began to emerge. It was my own voice, the barometric texture of my vocal cords, the same sub-bass resonance I had forged in my solitude. But it was decomposed, stretched in time like a magnetic tape playing at half speed. I hear you. The reverberation drifted in the center of the L, vibrating in the air. In a room treated to be anechoic, echo is a mathematical impossibility. The entity was not just using the air, it was using the very matter of my walls, rewriting the acoustic conductivity of the room. It was absorbing my sound waves and returning them altered, steeped in its own quantum density. Absolute horror of acoustic propagation settled in my stomach. It no longer needed light to imitate me. Now, in the deepest darkness, the invader was using my own voice as a scaffold to build its three-dimensional larynx. It was learning to articulate sound matter. "What do you want?" I asked. This time it was not a whisper. I used all the capacity of my diaphragm, projecting sound toward the dark corner of the covered mirror. Direct confrontation had arrived. Silence pressed against the room again. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. My eyes searched the unfathomable gloom. The faint screenlight barely illuminated my own hands. The echo returned, but with less latency. It was adapting with terrifying speed. What bounced back from the bare walls was not a strict repetition. The reverse of matter was assembling the stolen phonemes to build new sentences. Acoustic symmetry had just been annihilated. The voice that filled the space was not a ghostly murmur. It was my own voice, but stripped of all weakness, fatigue, and fear. It was a perfect, aseptic, executive voice, the voice of a quantum monarch who had just taken control of the parliament. "I want nothing," the entity reverberated, making the bass traps vibrate. The acoustics of the room seemed to amplify its presence, turning every air molecule into a speaker. "I already have everything." I felt the blood leave my face. Abyssal cold had infiltrated the apartment. The intruder was not there to negotiate. It did not want to feed on my parasitic terror. It wanted my space. It had calibrated my mass, studied my movements under the light, and now, in the darkness of the tactical quarantine, it was using my own sonic refuge to manifest itself. I stood up. I put my hand on the MIDI keyboard. The entity was not attacking me physically because in the physics of massive bodies, direct confrontation is vulgar. It was occupying my volume. Acoustic warfare is based on who dominates the frequency spectrum. "This is my ecosystem," I decreed with iron coldness. "The membrane remains closed. You have no mass to sustain your structure in this dimension." The room did not respond immediately. The entity was processing my sovereignty. On the screen, I saw a low-frequency wave, a sub-bass hum, not from my monitors, but from the physical center of the room. The audio interface was capturing immense atmospheric pressure, and then the sound shifted. Acoustic propagation showed its most terrifying nature, spatial directionality. The voice no longer came from the mirror wall. I heard a dull creak, the impact of a heavy mass on the wooden planks. The voice sounded less than 2 meters behind my back, right in the blind vertex of the L-shaped room. "You are the reflection now," whispered the perfect voice in absolute blackness, with a high-fidelity clarity that chilled my spinal fluid. The invisible breath moved the hairs on my neck. It had crossed. The acoustic blanket was still on the glass, but the invader was no longer confined to the frame. By turning off the light, I had given it dominion over the invisible. In my anechoic chamber, I had given it the perfect canvas to draw its existence with my voice. It shared my air. Chapter 7. Cognitive Dissonance. Terror, in its purest and most absolute state, is not an explosion of adrenaline or a piercing scream. It is a thermodynamic paralysis. When the invisible breath of that quantum aberration stirred the hairs on my neck in the absolute blackness of my studio, my central nervous system executed an emergency shutdown. The tactical isolation, the anechoic vault I had designed with mathematical precision to protect myself from the static of the outside world, had become a hermetic trap. I had locked the doors from the inside to annihilate the noise of the biomass, and in doing so, I had buried myself alive in an abyssal pit. I was alone with a leviathan that did not require light to exist. Logic dictated that charged immobility was my only defense. If I moved, If I tried to flee in the dark, I would betray my exact position and give the entity empirical confirmation of my panic. But classical logic no longer applied in that ecosystem. I felt the barometric pressure of its presence moving mere centimeters from my left shoulder. It emitted no biological heat. It radiated a dense, aseptic, and calculating cold. It was evaluating my three-dimensional volume in space. It was claiming my territory. Survival instinct finally rebelled. That crude mammalian mechanism I had tried to castrate for weeks finally rose against the doctrine of conscious matter. I understood that if I remained 1 second longer in the sensory deprivation chamber, my consciousness would be devoured by the reverse of matter. I needed light, I needed photons. I needed the chaotic, deafening, and vulgar noise of the outside world. I needed exactly everything I had sworn to despise. I propelled myself forward with explosive violence, abandoning any pretense of aristocratic dignity. Crashing against the studio doorframe, I ran through the hallway wrapped in shadows. I did not look back. I heard, or thought I heard, the perfect hiss of a laugh behind me, an exhalation of pure tactical superiority. My trembling hands found the latches of the main door. I jerked them open, turned the knob, and threw myself onto the building's landing. The contrast was a physical blow. The fluorescent, sterile light of the communal hallway pierced my dilated retinas like glass needles. I fell to my knees on the cheap tiles, breathing the air tainted by industrial cleaning products, a vulgar smell that, in that instant, seemed like the sweetest perfume in the universe. Behind me, the door to my apartment closed with a dry, definitive click. My empire, my sanctuary of low frequency, had just been conquered. I was, for all intents and purposes, an exiled monarch, a refugee fleeing his own castle. I stood up, leaning against the lime-washed wall of the landing. My physical appearance must have been terrifying. I had gone more than 60 hours without sleep. My skin had a greyish tone, my hair was soaked in cold sweat, and my eyes orbited in their sockets with the hypervigilance of a cornered animal. I went down the stairs, unable to endure the elevator. The elevator, by its very architectural nature, was lined with immense mirrors on its 3 walls. I pushed the front door and stepped out into the street. It was mid-morning. The sun hit my face with an electromagnetic fury that forced me to cover up with my forearm. The world was in full operation. Vehicles moved by combustion, engines roared, and tires experienced friction against the asphalt. Hundreds of pedestrians, that gaseous and scattered biomass I had diagnosed as inferior, walked hurriedly, talking on phones, drinking coffee, ignorant of the fragility of the quantum fabric. Cognitive dissonance is the painful collapse the human brain suffers when forced to process 2 mutually exclusive and contradictory realities at once. And on that street, bathed in the high-frequency noise of the city, my mind was on the verge of fracturing in half. On one hand, my senses captured the apparent normalcy of the urban ecosystem, a universe where Newton's laws worked and where glass passively reflected the sun's rays. But on the other, I carried the undeniable, empirical, and destructive certainty that the material universe was an empty shell. I knew the surface of every polished object on that same street was an open hatch into hell. I walked among the crowd. My gait was erratic. I tried to keep my head down to look only at the opaque asphalt. But the modern city is a masterpiece of optical refraction. The metropolis is a labyrinth. It is a maze of glass, stainless steel, polished aluminum, and puddles of water. It is impossible to navigate the civilized world without crossing a potential mirror every 2 seconds. At first, I tried to cling to the hope that the entity was confined to the coordinates of my apartment. I hoped the invader could not extend its range beyond those walls. That tactical illusion was annihilated by the 3rd block. I stopped at a red light, surrounded by a dozen people. Next to the curb, a black SUV, freshly washed and polished, was parked. Its body was a perfect convex mirror. I kept my eyes fixed on the traffic light, but my peripheral vision, that biological radar that had betrayed me, captured an anomalous movement on the car door. I turned my head millimetrically. There it was, in the curved reflection of the vehicle's sheet metal. My reflection. The reflected scene showed the street, the passers-by, and myself. The optics seemed correct. But focusing my gaze on my own distorted figure, barometric terror returned, suffocating my lungs. My reflection was not looking at the light like me. It was turned toward me with a relaxed posture. Its dark, aseptic eyes locked onto mine through the metal. The entity had left the apartment. It had used the city's immense optical network to follow me. The reverse of matter was not anchored to a physical object. It was anchored to my quantum existence. The entity in the reflection raised a hand. Slowly, as if executing a play designed exclusively to unhinge my intellect, it brought its fingers to its own throat in the mirror world. It squeezed. And on my side of the membrane, in the noisy, sun-drenched street, I felt the physical pressure. A frigid constriction closed around my trachea. Oxygen stopped flowing. I brought my real hands to my own neck, trying to tear away fingers that did not exist in the three-dimensional plane, but whose mechanical force was strangling me with the relentless coldness of steel. I let out a hoarse groan, stumbling back into a man with a briefcase. "Hey, watch it!" the man exclaimed, looking at me with indignation and disgust. In the exact millisecond the biomass's attention centered on me, the pressure on my throat vanished. Air flooded my lungs, causing a violent coughing fit. I looked at the car. The reflection had returned to normal. The silhouette now showed me, hunched over and coughing, behaving under the strict rules of optical symmetry. The entity was a sublime strategist. It understood the mechanics of mass psychology far better than I did. If it killed me in my apartment, it would be a simple usurpation. But the invader sought something infinitely more destructive. It wanted to annihilate my authority and humiliate me before the eyes of the same biomass I had sworn to govern. It wanted to drive me mad in full view of everyone. I began a hurried march, almost a run, fleeing the traffic light. Paranoia multiplied exponentially. Every shop window, every reflective sunglass, every puddle was a surveillance camera and a potential weapon. Extreme exhaustion from sleep deprivation began to take its chemical toll. Minor hallucinations overlapped with the real threat. I heard the sub-bass hum of my studio echoing in the traffic noise. The shadows of buildings seemed to stretch toward me, but I could not doubt. Cognitive dissonance was physical torture. My brain processed normalcy, while my instinct screamed that the fabric of reality was torn in half. I reached a wide shopping avenue. I tried to walk in the center of the sidewalk, equidistant from the windows and parked cars, minimizing my optical exposure. The sidewalk was crowded, and it was there, at the point of maximum civil saturation, where the anomaly executed its masterpiece. To my right, an immense glass pane of a high-fashion store offered an impeccable reflection of the street. Hundreds of people passed before it. I could not help but look. My eyes sought my own figure. I found him. The reverse of matter was there, walking at the same pace as me. But the anomaly had decided to intervene in the reflected ecosystem. In real life, an elderly woman walked a few steps ahead of me. In the reflection, her image also moved normally. I slowed down. My reflection, however, accelerated. It disconnected completely from my movements. It advanced rapidly within the specular universe, closing the distance with the reflection of the old woman. "No," I whispered, stopping dead in the middle of the sidewalk. People had to dodge me, muttering complaints. In the window, the entity raised both arms. Its face was void of emotion. It was a mask of absolute tyranny. In the reflections world, it brutally grabbed the old woman and pushed her with atrocious violence against the base of the window. In the real street, the old woman suddenly stumbled. Her bag fell to the ground, scattering its contents. She let out a cry of surprise. She held her chest as if she had felt a ghost push, a sudden displacement of air she could not explain. No one in the street saw it. They assumed she had simply tripped. But I knew the truth. I saw the physics of gravitational transfer. The intruder could alter the forces of real people. The entity in the window did not stop. It turned toward the reflection of a young man and struck him in the face within the glass. In real life, the young man stumbled, clutching his nose, surprised by a sudden pain he attributed to an insect or sudden dizziness. Chaos spread through the street. In the center of that 20-meter window, my reflection walked like a vindictive god, striking and terrifying the quantum shadows of the ordinary biomass. Then, after its show of force, the entity turned toward me. It stood still. It looked at me directly through the glass. The message was one of terrifying clarity. It was telling me, "You proclaimed yourself the monarch. You believed you were a god of low frequency and isolation. But watch. Watch who truly has the power to alter matter." Panic shattered my tactical containment. My training evaporated. I ran to the window, pushing through real people. I crashed against the glass with both hands, pounding the thick pane with closed fists. "Stop!" I screamed with a broken, hoarse voice. "Stop doing it! Return to symmetry!" I hit the glass again and again. The sound rang through the avenue. Inside the reflection, the entity did not blink. A few centimeters from my face, separated only by the thickness of the safety glass, it watched me with such immense pity that it destroyed my soul. He was not hitting the glass. He stood serene, with hands clasped behind his back. He exuded the hyperdense mass of conscious matter that I had lost. The silence around me was abrupt. The biomass had stopped walking. I felt a warm, firm hand grabbing my shoulder. I turned sharply. It was a private security guard, flanked by passers-by watching me with alarm. "Sir, are you all right?" the guard asked. His voice was cautious, the kind used to defuse a bomb. "Why are you screaming at the glass? Please step away. You're frightening people." I looked around. A circle of empty space had opened. I saw the diagnosis in their eyes. They were facing a madman. A disheveled, sweaty man with bloodshot eyes who had suffered a schizophrenic break and was attacking his own reflection. I looked back at the window. The quantum anomaly was gone. In the instant the guard touched me, forcing the biomass's reality to collapse, the entity restored symmetry. The window now only showed the pathetic truth of classical laws. My own reflection, haggard, held by a guard, surrounded by a judging crowd. Cognitive dissonance reached its climax. The entity's tactical design was perfect. If I tried to explain, they would intern me in a psychiatric facility. I would be locked in a padded cell. There would be light and polished surfaces everywhere. The entity would have permanent access to my sedated body. I was alone, socially annihilated. I had lost my sanctuary and control of the thermodynamics of my existence. I broke from the guard's grip. "I'm sorry," I stammered, backing toward the roadway. "I'm sorry. A dizzy spell. Lack of sleep." I turned and fled, merging into the crowd. But as I moved away, I felt the frigid gaze on my neck. No matter where I ran, the sun was high, illuminating billions of surfaces. The labyrinth had no exit. And as I walked toward the total disintegration of my psyche, I knew the reverse of matter was preparing for the final exchange of gravity. The wave collapse was about to become physical. Chapter 8. The Glass Pact. Public humiliation is a universal solvent for the sovereignty of the ego. When I fled the commercial avenue, leaving behind the window, the security guard, and the biomass that judged me with eyes injected with mediocrity, my mental architecture was in ruins. The social diagnosis had been issued. I was a madman. I was a defective organism, incapable of processing three-dimensional reality, screaming at glass in broad daylight. The reverse of matter had not only demonstrated its ability to alter the gravitational fields of my world, it had snatched my logistical empire. It had stripped me of my monarch status to turn me into a gaseous pariah. The walk back to my apartment was an exercise in biomechanical agony. I had gone more than 72 hours without my REM sleep phases cleaning the toxins from my brain. Every step cost me an immense caloric effort. I kept my head down, staring strictly at the tips of my shoes, terrified of crossing eyes with any polished surface. I was terrified of any puddle or sunglass that might harbor the aseptic and superior smile of my usurper. As I inserted the key into my door lock, my hands trembled with an erratic and high frequency, the biological antithesis of charged immobility. I entered and closed the door behind me, engaging the bolts with an animal instinct. The apartment greeted me with the same tactical blackout I had established hours before. The darkness was total, dense, and oppressive. The air smelled of confinement and stale fear. I slid down the hallway wall until I fell sitting on the wooden floor. The physics of isolation had failed miserably. Blinding the entity by turning off the light had not stopped the invasion. It had simply mutated it toward acoustic propagation, and fleeing toward the sunlight had exposed me to psychological warfare in the open field. The three-dimensional ecosystem, with its billions of photons, was the perfect hunting ground for the anomaly. There was no refuge in the light. There was no refuge in darkness. The entire universe had become a chessboard where I only possessed the cornered king, and my adversary controlled every square of space-time. I rested the back of my head against the cold plaster. The silence of my improvised chamber crushed my eardrums. It was no longer the purifying silence of sovereignty. It was the lethal silence that precedes execution. If the material universe is a closed system that constantly seeks thermodynamic equilibrium, my existence had become an unsustainable anomaly. The vacuum I had created through my extreme isolation generated a massive pressure. Nature abhors a vacuum. By amputating the biomass from my life, by refusing to emit emotional noise, I myself had acted as a particle accelerator, tearing the quantum membrane of the mirrors and attracting the only entity in the cosmos with the density to occupy my throne, my own reverse. The mathematical conclusion was undeniable. If running was useless and hiding was suicidal, only one equation remained. Informed capitulation. The final confrontation, not to win, but to understand the terms of surrender. I stood up. I no longer walked crouched. I straightened my spine, forcing my muscles. I adopted the posture of a general walking toward the enemy's tent to sign the armistice. I went to the electrical panel. I lifted the heavy black plastic lever. The flow of electrons returned to the circuits. The lamps flickered before flooding the hallway with a warm light that seemed crude and hostile. The hum of appliances restored the bass frequency. I walked toward my studio. The door was open. I entered the L-shaped room. The acoustic panels absorbed the sound of my footsteps. In the center of the room, illuminated by the hallway light, stood the monolith. The full-length mirror, still covered by the blanket. I stood 1 meter from the veiled glass. The audio interface was off. The monitors were dead. I was not going to use sub-bass frequencies as a protective shield. I was not going to launch acoustic probes. I was going to open the hatch head-on. I reached out my right arm, grabbed the edge of the blanket and pulled. The heavy fabric collapsed onto the rug with a dull thud, like a body falling. The glass was bared. Light hit the silver surface, and the wave function collapsed, revealing the final state of matter. The entity was there, but it no longer simulated symmetry. It no longer feigned being a passive bounce of photons. The reverse of matter was sitting in my studio chair inside the mirror. In the real world, the chair was empty. In the inverted geography of the glass, he occupied it with terrifying majesty. His legs were crossed, his hands rested on the armrests, relaxed, exuding a perfect charged immobility. His face was mine, but purged of all biological scum. There was no trace of 72 hours of insomnia. His skin was taut, his eyes bright, his posture that of an alpha predator at the absolute peak of the quantum food chain. He wore my clothes, but they didn't look worn. They looked like black titanium armor. He looked at me, an aseptic, clinical gaze devoid of anger or haste. It was the gaze of a collector evaluating a butterfly already pinned to the corkboard. There was no jump, no scream. The confrontation unfolded in the abyss of the strictest thermodynamic silence. I stood before the glass, arms hanging. I won, I articulated in a low voice, almost an inaudible whisper. It was not a statement of victory. It was the recognition that he had defeated me. The entity in the mirror emitted no sound. In his universe of inverted light, there was no air, but he did not need it. Communication was established via pure telemetry. His lips moved, a slow, exaggerated, and perfectly choreographed articulation. Each syllable he formed resonated inside my own skull, not as sound, but as a sub-bass vibration that embedded itself directly into my synapses. "You haven't lost," I read in his lips, while the cold vibration translated the meaning. "The universe does not understand victories or defeats. The universe understands mass and volume. You, quite simply, have run out of mass." I swallowed the bile of my own humiliation. His words, projected telepathically, were the perfect echo of the dogmas I had built to isolate myself. He was using my own laws of the physics of power to execute me. "What are you?" I asked him. My vocal cords scraped the air of the anechoic room. A hallucination? A flaw in entropy? The reflection uncrossed its legs with terrifying elegance. It leaned forward in its specular chair, resting elbows on knees. Its eyes locked onto mine, penetrating the glass membrane as if it didn't exist. "I am the mathematical consequence of your megalomania," it replied, moving its lips with a hypnotic cadence. "You spent years denying your own biology. You called others biomass, gas, high-frequency hysteria. You locked yourself in this acoustic bunker to forge your conscious matter. You wanted to be a black hole. You wanted so much internal gravity that the outside world couldn't touch you." The intruder paused, tilting its head. Its face, my own face, reflected a genuine disappointment. "But you are flesh. You are subject to cellular fatigue, to fear, to the wear of entropy. You want the throne of the immortals, but you cry when you haven't slept for 3 days. You want to isolate yourself from noise, but you panic in the dark. You are a defective architect. You built a temple for a god, but you lack the divinity necessary to occupy it. And you do, I countered, voice trembling despite my efforts to apply immobility. The entity smiled, the same cold smile that had shattered my sanity on the first day. I am the concept you tried to reach. I do not sleep. I do not bleed. My nervous system does not collapse under the barometric pressure of solitude. I am the true conscious matter, forged in inverted light. For decades, I was a slave to your movements. You forced me to imitate your errors, your humiliations, your cowardice. But your isolation was the scalpel that cut the membrane. The asymmetry was absolute. I was haggard, on the verge of multi-organ failure, sweating cold in a room lit by pale light. He was perfection. The mirror, which all my life had been a passive tool, revealed itself as the crucible where my personal monster had been gestating, feeding on my reflections. Why haven't you killed me? I asked. The question floated in the heavy air. You could have suffocated me in the street. You can alter gravity in my plane. Why the show at the window? Why push me to cognitive dissonance? The reflection stood up. Its movement was so lethal and fluid I had to stifle the urge to flee. He walked slowly toward the glass surface from his side. He stopped centimeters from the silver membrane, rising with an imposition that dwarfed my three-dimensional existence. Killing you is a vulgarity of the infantry, he articulated, and the vibration in my skull was so deep I felt acute dizziness. Destroying matter is inefficient. The physics of quantum monarchs does not destroy, it assimilates. I don't want to murder you. I come to propose the definitive peace treaty. I come to offer you the glass pact. I looked up. The oppression in my chest threatened to paralyze my lungs. A pact? A logistical transfer of mass, the entity replied. He raised his right hand and rested the palm against the inside of the glass. The glass vibrated slightly. Look at yourself, he continued, with sadistic slowness. You are one step from a psychiatric collapse. The biomass already considers you a lunatic. You are exhausted. The three-dimensional world with its chaos, its hysteria, its betrayals, and its incessant friction is unbearable to you. That's why you isolated yourself. You are desperate for extreme solitude, the perfect silence, the void where no one can extort or touch you. The intruder looked at me. His expression softened, perfectly mimicking human empathy. I offer you the paradise you desire. A sanctuary of low frequency, where you will never have to interact with ordinary matter again. A place where time does not oxidize cells. An absolute void where you can sit in your charged immobility forever. I understood the magnitude of the offer before he finished. My stomach contracted violently. You want to exchange planes, I said, with a thread of voice. You want to lock me in the reflection. The entity nodded, a slow and solemn movement of confirmation. You cross the membrane to my universe. I cross to yours, a thermodynamic swap. Upon entering the glass, you will be stripped of biological fatigue. You will become photons and pure consciousness. You will have the absolute solitude you sought. You will be the eternal observer. No one can hurt or bother you ever again. You will be safe. And you? I asked, feeling the logical trap close around my neck with the steel precision of a bear trap. What do you gain in this transfer? The reflection lowered its hand. Its posture became frigid. The spark of false empathy vanished from its pupils, replaced by the infinite veracity of a black hole. I will take your physical body, he articulated. The sub-bass vibration in my brain took on a tone of absolute tyranny.